There we go. And additionally, I was asked by several folks if you are having a hard time seeing only the speaker, in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom, there is a button that says View. And if you change that view to Speaker View, you will only see the person who is speaking as opposed to the vast collective of nearly 75 people who are on this call. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, David.
Thank you. And I'm just going to pass it right over to Derek.
It's a shame that Jasmine isn't with us. What, the internet just went out for the entire city of Kitchener-Waterloo, or?
Well, much of it, and I'm trying to be in touch with her on phone. So hopefully.
Good Lord. Okay, well, hopefully she'll come on. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what's been happening specifically at Harvard, with the understanding that there are commonalities across North America. And so I'll talk a little bit about specificities, but also about commonalities between Harvard and other universities. It's by breaking down the issue into the various players at work. First, there's the university administration. And there's been an assumption in a lot of the conversations, certainly within the Jewish communities of North America, that there is a centralized administration in a university and a president that can make a decision and things can change. And maybe there are universities where that can happen, but there are many where it can't. And Harvard is one of them. Harvard really is not a unified university. It is a group of at least 15, 16 major schools, almost completely autonomous. There is no single code of conduct among them. There is no single disciplinary body. So students can be subject to disciplinary hearings in one unit, like the law school or the medical school or the business school. And the outcome could be totally different from if they're undergraduates being subject to disciplinary hearings within Harvard College. And so a lot of the, I would say, the slowness of response, at least at Harvard, but I think other universities, a lot of the differential responses, it's not because of ill will. It's because of just the basic structure of the university. In the case of Harvard, this is baked into the founding statutes that go back to when they were redone in the 1700s. There's a long history, Dylan was talking about this, within universities in North America, of tolerating protest within the concept of free speech, which is absolutely imperative at public universities in the US and has been adapted by Harvard in one of its very few central tenets, which is that of essentially accepting the provisions of the First Amendment, which would not technically be applied or applicable or obligatory at a private institution. But Harvard has accepted them. It would take an awful lot to undo that. And those freedoms of speech include saying things that are objectionable, offensive, fearsome, and wrong. So that's something that we all have to grapple with. At Harvard, and I think at a lot of other universities, there's a long history of forbearance towards student demonstrators. I've talked to a lot of people in the Jewish community who ask, why haven't demonstrators or the people in the encampment at Harvard been, quote, punished, end quote? Well, back in 1986, when there was an anti-apartheid encampment at Harvard, it stayed up for several weeks, including during commencement. There was another encampment in 2011 during the Occupy Wall Street movement. That one eventually petered out because it got cold. There were also encampments, and I think Massachusetts Hall, the administrative nerve center of Harvard, was occupied for several weeks. And I forget if it was in the fossil fuel encampment protests or the living wage protests of 2016, 2019. The point is that there have been many, many instances of this kind of civil disobedience, and the students have gotten off really with no substantive discipline. Now, maybe they should have, but they didn't. And so it makes it very difficult, if you're thinking of precedent, to then move forward and make things different in this case. And to get back to something Dylan said, there's no single effective way to resolve the encampment issue. So police intervention has happened at many universities, and sometimes it seems to work. And other times it doesn't. It just escalates tensions, as at Columbia University. At Harvard, the president tried a different tactic, which was to wait it out. And sure enough, eventually, most of the students in the encampment got tired. Most of them left. He very gradually ratcheted up disciplinary threats. By the time it might have been necessary for the police to be called, the students agreed to withdraw in exchange for some token, I think, some token concessions. So it's a very difficult thing for an administration to deal with these. I was talking to a rabbi who said, "Why don't you just hire a guy? Hire an anti-Semitism czar who will come in and fix everything." But it's not that easy. Second issue is students. At Harvard and at elite universities in North America, and I would think certainly at a school like the University of Toronto, there's an increasingly diverse student body. More and more students who are either from or have heritage in the Global South. More and more students at Harvard, for example, who identify as BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, people of color. These students have a whole set of values and interests that is a reflection and part of their subject position, where they come from literally, and apart from the kind of high school education they got. I mean, the fact is that there's a kind of regnant progressivism, capital P, among affluent, urban, bicoastal youth. And if you have those kinds of backgrounds, then sympathy for the Palestinian cause just, it is simply part of the progressive portfolio, as it were, at the moment. So there's widespread sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And this generic sentiment in and of itself is not anti-Semitic. It's about the liberation of an oppressed people and saving the lives of, people who were being killed by the scores of thousands. There is a small group of, I would estimate, a few hundred among Harvard's 22,000 students who are much more militant. Most of them are not explicitly anti-Semitic, and yet they have done things like post social media posts that invoke an vow to destroy Israel, and then occasionally overt anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, anti-Semitic stereotypes, and so forth. So there's an atmosphere in which there's certainly a potential in the pro-Palestinian camp to cross that line into overt anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of concern in the American Jewish community, at least, about the declining number of Jewish students at Harvard, and that this is often seen as part of a malevolent desire on the part of the university to sort of restrict the role of Jews in Harvard's life. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that in general, admissions at Harvard and its peer institutions have increasingly favored a diverse student body, again, people from many different racial, ethnic, and national backgrounds. Jews are identified, rightly or wrongly, as white. And it is because of this general, I think, change in admissions practices that affect students across the United States that Jews might find it harder to get into Harvard, across the US might find it harder to get into Harvard. I also want to say quickly about the diversity of Jewish views of the situation at Harvard. This is very important. There is, and I've done listening sessions as part of my work with a task force where we talked to well over 500 people, almost all of them Jews. And I would estimate that about 30% of that number are deeply worried about the situation at Harvard. They are frightened. They are anxious. They have been socially excluded and snubbed. A few of them have been intimidated and threatened and abused verbally. It's very bad for them. There is, on the opposite side of the spectrum, maybe 20% of the Harvard Jewish undergraduates are actually quite pro-Palestinian. They've been involved in the demonstrations. They've been involved in the encampment. And one of them said to me that the only time they've experienced anti-Semitism at Harvard was from other Jews, that is, Jewish students who reviled them for their pro-Palestinian sentiments. And then the middle, I think the largest single contingent at Harvard are Jewish students who have had a rough time this year, but who have dealt with it well, who appreciate the complexity of the issues Mackenzie and Dylan were talking about balancing free speech with protection of others. These are great students. They're very mature and they're very thoughtful. And I feel like their voices are getting left out of the conversation. It's much more clear that Israeli students at Harvard and at other universities have been particularly singled out for ill treatment. There's an assumption that an Israeli student, simply by dint of being Israeli, is part of a war machine as David said, a quote, settler colonial enterprise, end quote. And Israeli students are often shunned and excluded simply because of their passport, which is a violation, actually, of, again, one of the few general policies Harvard has, is you can't discriminate based on national origin because that's part of Title VI. Then just to sum up, the faculty at any university, certainly any major elite university, tend to be progressive or very liberal. Faculty at Harvard have been largely supportive of the student protests, largely supportive of the student encampment, and of the so-called Harvard 13. That is, the undergraduates who were denied a graduation and put on probation of as long as a year and a half, depriving them of jobs and of postgraduate opportunities and so forth. And this is tied up with much bigger issues involving faculty governance, who runs the university, where the undergraduates become, as it were, a kind of a vehicle for playing out these struggles. Last but not least, the alumni. A lot of the voices you've been reading that have been talking about the situation at Harvard, that are angry about the situation at Harvard, are alumni, Jewish alumni who went to Harvard in the past, 20, 30, 50 years ago, and they are alarmed and they're puzzled by recent events. And the answer is really quite simple, which is Harvard is not the university today. It's not what it was 20 or 40 or 50 years ago. There's a different student body, there's a different political vibe, and that generational difference is enormous. And it's one of the things that's making it so hard for us to come up with a common language and a common conversation regarding what's happening, whether it's at Harvard or at other universities. With that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Derek, very much. Just to bring everyone up to date, I'm in touch with Jasmine. She continues to try, and hopefully she'll be able to join us. So let me now turn to both John and Mark and invite each of them to raise some questions and make some observations of their own, challenge any of our speakers to date. Mark?
Thank you, David, and thank you to Mackenzie, Derek, Dylan, for their remarks and perspectives, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't agree with. And one of the things that has not been discussed, which I think we should make reference to and think about, is going back to the beginning of all this. And the question that I have in my mind is, how is it that when students engage in civil disobedience, like encampments, which, from my mind, is a significant issue that should be dealt with in a very severe way. But how is it that those encampments place those who are in the encampments in a position where they can demand of the university leadership, the administration, the demand that they need to engage in discussion and negotiation regarding university policies and positions on various issues. And in the absence of those engagements or encampments, they wouldn't be necessarily engaged in those discussions. In other words, if students really want to press their point, there's other ways to do it, it seems to me. Students could, through their student councils, through their student bodies, or a group of them together, could easily communicate with the president of the university and say, you know, we'd like to sit down and have a very methodical, heart-to-heart, in-depth conversation with you about the university's position on these issues regarding the Middle East conflict and about Israel and about investments and so on. But the fact that they've engaged in encampments and really used that as a lever to force the university, if you look at the university statements from University of Toronto and York University and other universities in the States, you gather from that that the lesson is all you need to do in order to get the attention of the administration is engage in some degree, some serious level of disobedience or civil disobedience And then you'll get our attention, and we'll begin to negotiate with you. We'll begin to talk to you. The universities are places where people should be engaged in conversations and learnings at all times. And it seems to me that this is not the way that the leadership of the university should succumb, in my view, to the demands of any group on any issue. And that's, to me, that's an issue that is not being well advanced or discussed in any of the discussions we see. And when you look at the statements that have come out of the universities, it's particularly the ones from U of T and York in the last day or two, they don't deal with these kind of questions. And I think they're sadly lacking in a probative analysis of what's really going on.
Who would like to respond first? Dylan, I see your hand up.
I mean, I don't know if John wants to say something before I jump back in, but no? So listen, Mark, I think just pulling on some of those threads, I think that there are a whole bunch of different issues here. One of them is the use of encampments and blockades, and I agree. I mean, there have been some cases of encampments on campuses in the past, but as someone who lives in Ottawa, you know, we are quite familiar with a different kind of encampment that took over our city last year. I think that there are senses or a sense in the community as a whole that if the blockades or encampments were of a different ideological persuasion, the reactions would be quite different. You know, I walked through the trucker protest a few times a week when it was here. I found it distasteful. I was in favor of them being moved off. I'm not sure the Emergencies Act was needed, but you didn't have to pass an ideological test to walk through what was actually probably a more fitting place to be protesting against government involvement, which was the lawn of the legislature. And we invoked the Emergencies Act and froze all of their bank accounts. To cross through some of these encampments, you have to pass an ideology test to get through the door, which would preclude anybody with an attachment from Israel from being able to go through. I think the other big piece here is around the specifics of Israel and anti-Semitism and the wave of anti-Semitism that we're seeing now. I was fortunate in May to be able to join a group of university leaders. Wouldn't have put myself in that category, but I was invited to come with some presidents, some chancellors on the March of the Living. They did a special track for university leaders this year. And I'll tell you, I mean, I think the encampments are a symptom of the broader disease. Even at Auschwitz, on Holocaust Memorial Day, the anti-Israel protesters were standing at the gates, screaming obscenities. And you know, if you wanted to see where the anti-Semitism lives in the anti-Israel movement, it becomes a lot clearer when that when you're sort of seeing that up close and personal. I think for those who are on the march, it clarified a lot of things in their minds as well. I was at an event last night and talked to a couple of sitting federal cabinet ministers in the Trudeau government who said, look, you know, this has just gone too far. It needs to stop. Not in all the years of my life have I seen this kind of a wave of anti-Semitism. We never thought it would be possible here, et cetera. I think that when we look at the encampments alongside protests in specific neighborhoods like the, you know, Avenue Road and 401 neighborhood in Toronto, when you look at protests outside of synagogues across the country, outside Jewish community centers, the graffitiing of Jewish community centers, and so on, that in many of the individual instances, police or other institutions have, rightfully so, policies aimed at avoiding violence and the worst kind of escalation. And I actually think that's the right policy for universities. For example, at McGill, you had students that blockaded and surrounded the Bronfman building. Jewish community derided it as being anti-Semitic because they chose a Jewish donor, you know, named building to be blockading. Again, the McGill policy and the police policy was based on massive protests that had nothing to do with Israel and stopping them from becoming violent. Where the problem comes in the current context is it's not about that one protest, and it's not about the one encampment on campus, and it's not about the one-day blockade of an intersection in a Jewish neighborhood. It's about a systemic wave of anti-Semitism across all of these instances that requires enforcement of the law, and it requires public officials, elected officials, to stand up and show some moral clarity. And I think in a lot of these cases, university presidents who in most cases have spoken out about how repugnant they find the encampments on their campus and the fact that they would like to see them dismantled. Not in every case, but in many of them. But you have silence from the mayor's office, and you have silence from the premier's office here in Ontario under the Ford government, and you have relative silence from the federal government as well, because there's a fire burning and no one wants to touch it. And so they let it burn, and they let whoever is at the closest level of responsibility bear, the brunt of the damage. So that's the way I see it. And I'm not saying that all of the protesters are anti-Semitic or that it's a black and white issue on campus. But it's undoubtedly true that there's a wave of anti-Semitism and that these are a part of that broad phenomenon.
So,
and I was going to say, Derek, I know you're going to jump in,
I
that
have
we should have another session on anti-Semitism and the different definitions.
Before Derek jumps in, I just want to say this. First of all, I agree with most of what you just said, Dylan. However, your points, which are all very good and valid, have nothing to do with the point I was trying to make. And the point I was trying to make was a very, I thought, simple point, which was, I don't think that civil disobedience and encampments is a way that university leadership should succumb to that as a means to then say, we're going to negotiate and we're going to engage in conversation with whoever's involved in those encampments. That's not the way to get the attention of the university administration or leadership to engage in any kind of issue. That's the only point I was trying to make. I think that was the wrong thing to do. And I think it's wrong for every university. I'll give you one example. Colorado State University, the president of Colorado State University, when this was about to happen, posted signs around the campus and said to students, and basically said, if you engage in any of these kind of activities on campus, you will be suspended. And then the sign said, and if you continue, you will not only be suspended, you'll be expelled. And the result at California State University was no encampments. Nothing happened. All I'm saying is that, and you raised the point too, we need leadership. We need leadership at the political level. We need leadership at the university level to take strong, principled positions about how to deal with these things. And I don't see that happening right now.
Okay,
Can I just respond really quickly before you go to Derek?
Because I
Just
want
to that,
both Derek
I'll be super fast, David. Just to that point, I don't necessarily agree, Mark. I think that number one, to a certain extent, it has worked because they've drawn a huge amount of attention to their cause. I think there are questions about whether university administrations should acquiesce at all to any of the demands that are there. And in this particular case, my personal politics suggest I hope that they don't. However, the idea, if you take it to a different case, that students, I agree they shouldn't encamp. I agree that they shouldn't be breaking the law. But I will say, in the case of Colorado State University, if they did the same thing around a climate survival rally on campus against carbon emissions, and the university came out and said that, I think public opinion would feel very differently about the curtailing of the rights. And so that's why I think it's a lot more complex in terms of the actions and how easy it is for university leadership to carve out the right position on this. And some of them have gotten lucky and some less luckily. And at U of T, in the beginning, they told them you're absolutely not allowed to set up an encampment. They put out threats saying that faculty that were found to be violating it could be suspended or fired, and that students could have suspensions or potentially expulsions participating in the encampment. The encampment's still there. So, and we kind of cherry pick the examples where police worked or, it worked out this way. And the truth is, the local context is so different that it's really difficult to say what the right course of action is from my point of view.
Okay, now let me turn to Derek and then to Mackenzie.
It's funny how there are people of a certain age in the United States who took part in anti-Vietnam War movements, and they took over administrative buildings to fight against ROTC, let's say at Harvard, or to not allow Dow Chemical to do interviews at the University of Wisconsin, and they engaged in massive civil disobedience to make their point. And many people in the United States at the time thought these people were, were agitators and should be clapped in jail, but they had lots of support. And of course, to this day, some people think of these students who are now anything but students as heroes. So it really Is it a question of substance, or is it a question of the cause? And as far as the cause goes, it's important to listen to the pro-Palestinian case, even if you don't always agree with it. It's very important to listen. And I feel like not enough of that is happening. And what the pro-Palestinian students at Harvard have been saying is that we're doing what we're doing precisely because no one's been listening to us any other way. We have asked nicely. We have had our quiet meetings, our engagements, our classes, and we've played by the rules. And, you know, what has it gotten us? In their view, okay, in their view, Harvard and other universities support Israel, and Israel's doing things they don't like. For them, engaging in the encampments and the protests and the like is necessary action in order to make themselves heard. We don't have to agree with them. We just have to understand their logic. And just very quickly, you know, Dylan, you kind of moved from the university realm to the realm of city politics and national politics and so forth. And I just want to throw in very quickly, as Jeff Kopstein, who's been on this Israel Dialogues program, said, based on his own studies of anti-Semitism at American universities, he said, our campuses don't have an anti-Semitism problem. America has an anti-Semitism problem. And that America, and I would assume Canada, really have ambient levels of anti-Semitism that are no higher at the universities. So the focus on universities in and of itself is a bit interesting. More young people, they have more time on their hands, they have time to set up encampments. But the underlying problems are actually not in the universities in and of themselves. They're much deeper than that. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
Daisy.
and I'll just chime in and say I agree with most of what Derek said, but I think that, again, to say that these students didn't engage, again, whatever their issue is, and my personal politics led me to believe I don't agree with their demands of divesting from Israeli universities and many of the things that these encampments are pushing for. But again, civil disobedience has been inherently used by people who don't have power to break a law intentionally to prove a point. And so I think it's really easy for people who like work in advocacy and have resources and know about these structures to be able to do that. But again, another point about this is that conversations about this issue don't really lend to productive debate, especially as the war is going on and so many people have such a hot or are so strong on each side. And that's not to validate anybody, because a lot of the things that you hear at these camps about Zionists, about Israel not having the right to exist, are so problematic and obviously need to be dealt with. But at the same time, you have to treat these protesters, just like Dylan said, like you would treat any other encampment, because again, Canada does have laws and regulations against hate speech that do regulate these kinds of things. But it needs to be played out in the public sphere. And I will also say, as a non-Jew, I talk about this in a lot of my personal spaces, and most of Canadians do sympathize with the humanitarian crisis that is happening in Gaza, but at the same time, think that these protesters go too far and are unreasonable in their demands. And both of those things can be true. But again, if my family was halfway across the world in a humanitarian situation and nobody was listening to me, I also might camp out to bring attention to their cause because you have no other resources. But again, there are organizations that do this professionally, that advise on how to do it. And you don't have violence, you don't have derogatory terms, and you can't have those violent calls to actions. And you also have to accept the consequences of what happens no matter what, because that's baked into why you broke the law in the first place.
Thank you. John, finally over to you. Thanks for being patient.
Not at all. I'm not an expert in any of this, and I really appreciate hearing from everybody else. And I don't think we should confuse, and I don't think Dylan was intending to, I don't think we should confuse the wider issue of anti-Semitism, which is a problem, and the situation on campus. But what I will say about both is that the rise in anti-Semitism in North America and the rise of anti-Semitism on campus is directly related to the war. And there has been an increase in anti-Semitism, but there's a great discussion about whether that's because we're finally recognizing it and noting it, and people are able to complain, etc. but I don't think there was a massive rise in anti-Semitism before the war. And I think, and I am of the view, and many people disagree with me, that when the war is over, these encampments will disappear and the protesters will disappear. And the rampant anti-Semitism that we see and Islamophobia will go back into the depths of where it is and was and has always been. I mean, I know that people like Orban and Trump and others have allowed anti-Semitism to come out in a way that it never did before. They've allowed all kinds of racism to come out because leaders model for their populist voters. But I think we have to, as Derek said and as Mackenzie said, we have to realize that on those campuses, I don't know what the proportion is, but you've got people who are anti-war. You've got people who are anti-occupation. You've got people who are anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. Now, all of those things are legitimate. And you've got people at the other end who are anti-Semites and who are spouting hate speech and being violent. And it's those people that you want to deal with. But you shouldn't put all those other people in the same basket and say you can't protest and you can't have an encampment because 10% or 20% or 5% are violent or are blatantly anti-Semitic and espousing hate speech. And I think in a free society and a liberal society, which we hope we have, you sometimes have to accommodate the crazies, the extremists, and allow legitimate protest and anti-war protest in this case, and anti-occupation protest, and frankly, anti-Zionism protest. If you're a one-stater, if you're a Palestinian or a Jew who's a one-stater, I don't agree with it, but it's legitimate protest. And it's not anti-Semitism by definition. Okay, you may be an anti-Semite and be an anti-Zionist, but you may well be a Peter Beinart who's a one-stater and is definitely not an anti-Semite. And I just think we have to continue to keep that in mind. And it's very, very, very tough on administrations and very tough on police and very tough on politicians who are trying to find some kind of, not middle ground, but some kind of way to respond to multiple pressures from wealthy Jewish alumni to, some Palestinian kid or that's out there protesting. Complicated. And I really thank all of you for, making it, well, at least setting out the issues. I'm not sure we've solved the problem. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Look, with this Zoom format, we're able to see everyone who's online, and there are some hands up. So let me take a moment before going back to Dylan and Mackenzie. Let me invite Shalom Schachter and then Rabbi Kay. And then then I'll go back to Dylan and Mackenzie.
Also Rabbi Schachter, for the record.
All right, for the record.
Thank you. I think it would be important for the attendees to know that the CJA has a support group that provides support to students and faculty and workers in other institutions who are experiencing what they feel is anti-Semitism. And so you can pass this on to your family members and anybody else who this is an issue for. And also, CJA would welcome any volunteers, especially lawyers, who are prepared to join the support group. You can be in touch with Richard Marceau from CJA, and he can direct you to the appropriate person.
Mark Anshin, right here on this panel, is involved in that project too.
Right. And I was going to just say the same thing, Shalom. So thank you for doing it.
All right. Where is Rabbi Kay?
I'm here.
There you go.
I have two two questions, one for Derek and one for John. And there are things that I'm actually asking. These are not straw man questions that I'm putting up. These are genuine questions. So, Derek, one of the things you quoted was this idea that universities represent societies that they are part of, and that Canada has an anti-Semitism problem, which is why there's an anti-Semitism problem at a university. And I happen to agree with you, but I'm not actually sure that universities represent the broad feelers of society, especially elite universities like your own, where explicitly, in fact, they are meant to be small petri dishes of a certain level of society. And so I would love to hear you respond to how perhaps that changes that particular level of the narrative. And then the second thing, John, is that you quoted two far right-wing politicians, former presidents, leaders who are inflaming the essence of anti-Semitism at the moment. But a lot of what the Jewish community is afraid of right now is liberal, left-wing aligned anti-Semitism. And so I'm really curious why you felt the need to highlight Trumpism as a response to what's going on right now, when Trumpism, to my mind, and please don't get me wrong, I'll say it on the record, I am not a fan. I am very much where I am allowed to vote, not an endorser of any kind of Trumpism. But I do find the lifting up of Trumpism as the spark that has lit anti-Semitism in the West, as opposed to discussing the fear that people are feeling right now from a progressive anti-Semitism, to be a really interesting choice on your part. And I would love to hear why one and not the other, or perhaps just an evaluation of it. So I'll hand it back to Derek and John.
Right, Derek, then John,
Thanks.
then Dylan.
No, it's a great question. It's true that universities only represent a minority, sometimes rather small minority of country's population, because only so many people get university educations, and only a tiny minority get educations at places like Harvard. And I would guess, I'm just thinking of Kopstein's numbers, but also a guy named Eitan Hirsch, who's done some really good sociological work on anti-Semitism in universities, that in general, anti-Semitism levels they are salient, they are present in universities. They might very well be lower than the general population. That is, if you give people a bunch of anti-Jewish stereotypes, and how many of these, if any, do you accept? I think Eitan Hirsch actually found that there certainly is much higher anti-Semitism correlated with people with far right-wing views than people with far left-wing views. And that's very, very clear from Eitan Hirsch's, and I can dig up the source and send it to anyone who's interested. So I think universities then might actually be, in some ways, to get back to the notion of a petri dish. They're also petri dishes of cold and flu germs, I can tell you. But universities actually can be better spaces, or should be better spaces, for talking about these things. The problem is that I think in this way, faculty and the administration's been derelict, in that they haven't done enough to encourage these kinds of civil and difficult conversations. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'll just jump in on that one. I'm kind of tired of hearing about universities that are elite institutions. We all went to them. We all went to these elite institutions. I remember, I went to LSE. I remember when LSE was considered to be this radical leftist hotbed, and it was basically an anti-Vietnam set of protests. Mm-hmm. Universities are by definition, elite. So is government. So are all these other things. And by labeling them as elite, we're basically saying you're out of touch with reality. Universities are doing now what they've always done. They're a place where people think, and I don't think they're so much more liberal or so different than they used to be. But on your other point, Rabbi, the reason, and I don't dismiss by any stretch, the left who deny that October 7 happened, or praise Hamas for their resistance on October 7th. You're absolutely right. The reason that I raise Donald Trump and Viktor Orban and Bolsonaro is because they are leaders of major countries. I mean, one in Europe, the most powerful in the world, a major leader in Latin America, and they are modeling for their populations. There are very few left politicians in power that are spreading blatant anti-Semitism or even anti-Zionism. In fact, to my mind, there's not very many left politicians in power, period. Or even center, we're in a crisis as far as that's concerned. But I don't disagree with you, and I know that there are so many progressives who have been so disappointed by what they thought their fellow travelers on the left, who have come out with shocking statements and shocking views. And I agree with you 100%, but I just don't think, I'm more worried about people who are in power and who can spread lies and hateful speech and seemingly get away with it without having their polls affected.
So I'm going to jump in quickly on the
Go ahead.
note of left-wing anti-Semitism, because just to share an anecdote, when I was executive director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, we had a conference with 100 different student leaders from all across Canada, and EDI training, equity, diversity, inclusion, was a priority. And I remember there was this student who raised his hand and asked a very basic entry-level question that was very much to get the room talking and get them moving. And the facilitator that was in charge of creating a safe space and having these conversations looked at him and kind of smirked and went, "What a white man question." And then the student then responded and raised his hands and he went, "Well, I'm Jewish. Does that help?" And the whole room laughed. And I remember this was pre my engagement in the Jewish community, being so fundamentally uncomfortable with it, but not quite having the vocabulary or the tools to be able to deconstruct that. And I think that's because left-wing anti-Semitism is fundamentally different. And it manifests in a lot of different ways where these people don't think they're anti-Semitic. They know swastikas are wrong. They do not believe in replacement theory, but they also have conceptualizations of equity and privilege within society that are so constructed in race that Jewish identity doesn't fit in it in a neat way. And so a lot of times it's just fundamentally rejected, which is not okay, because now we have anti-Semitism at record high schools, at record high instances. There's regularly at this point bullets in schools, and Canada doesn't have a school shooting problem. Canada has a school shooting in Jewish schools problem. And a lot of left-wing spaces just don't know how to deal with that. And I think that is definitely a different kind of challenge, but the world is moving in that way. We have DEI training and it's in our spaces and it's not going anywhere, but we need to accommodate them so that it fits the experiences of the highest targeted community for religiously motivated hate crimes. And that's Jews. Dylan?
Sure. Listen, I think pulling a little bit off of that, but largely off of John's, and those who tune in regularly know that John and I like to disagree with each other. I mean, number one, John, in terms of world leaders, I mean, there's Lula in Brazil, there's the president of Colombia, there's the current prime minister of Spain. Left-wing populism is on the rise, just like right-wing populism is on the rise. I think they both tap into the exact same core issue, which is, a dividing populace and the increase in populism in a world that feels broken in terms of the social contract in a lot of societies. The other piece, and I know, I mean, it's hard to deal with this issue without delving into anti-Semitism. I really think we should have a whole session on it. It's such a worrying subject at the moment, but also very interesting to pull at the threads of. But one piece, and I think Mackenzie will agree with me, just to pull at your conception of what racism is. One of the things that we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years is that racism is not about, quote, racists. It's, the majority of anti-Black racism that's experienced is not from the Ku Klux Klan or skinheads or people going around yelling racial epithets. It's in the it's baked into the attitudes of the general population. It's about how Black people interact with society. And anti-Semitism is exactly the same. It's about deeply seated notions of Jewish power, Jewish money, Jewish control, Jewish Jews as the ultimate example of evil, Jews as sneaky and working behind the scenes. And we know the controversial aspect of that is Israel becoming the Jew among the nations, as Erwin Kotler says, with all of those traits applied to it. And I think the one question I'd have Derek in terms of the study that was done in terms of attitudes of folks on campus towards Jews in general is, if you ask them similar questions about Israel with those traditional anti-Semitic tropes attached to it, it would be very interesting to see what came out of it. But the point I really wanted to make, to John's point about world leaders and the politics of division, is that the increasing challenge of social license for universities, that we have a battle between the hardcore progressives and a conservative, what they would call it, common sense reaction to some of what they call the woke agenda that's going on in Canada. We're going to face this right now. My good friend Shu Valoy Majumdar, who's a conservative, which those who know me will know I'm not a conservative, but is a conservative member of parliament, says, the problem on campuses is people are trading critical theory for critical thinking, or critical thinking for critical theory. And the sense that everything has become about ticking boxes and some of the challenges of a EDI or DEI agenda that's become very central to a lot of what we do in terms of our campuses. Again, I agree with I actually think, Derek, that the accusations that faculty are all a monolith of post-colonial theorists is, in most of my institutions, patent nonsense. I mean, most of them are hard scientists, engineers, computer scientists, people that work in different fields, who probably are, might vote liberal or probably vote Democrat, at least in the United States, where the contrast is more stark. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do, in the university system here, is to sort of showcase to the conservatives that intellectual diversity is a good thing, but also this isn't a monolith. But the last thing to say is, in these culture wars, at least in my view, as has so often been the case throughout history, Jews find themselves as a bit of the canary in the coal mine on this, and I think it isn't only that progressive spaces and those who are practicing EDI and responsible for it can't quite figure out how to deal with Jews. In many cases, they're actively hostile. They are trying to label Jewish persecution as not worthy of being addressed. And that's something that does need to be addressed on university campuses. And I think if you go and look at the testimony of the Canadian university presidents that went before Parliament a couple of weeks ago, you'll see there's a recognition that there's work to do on that. It doesn't mean we should throw out the baby with the bathwater of all of the other important things that, striving for equity and diversity on our campuses does achieve.
So let me invite Derek to respond, and then to John. And then I have a question or comment.
Well, one point is that the left, as one colleague of mine said, the left tends to be monocausal. They sort of have one big cause at any given time. A long time ago, many, many decades ago, when I was young, it was apartheid in South Africa. And more recently, it was BLM. I mean, still an issue. But Gaza, in particular, the Palestinian issue in general, has become the issue of this era. And all kinds of intersectional concerns regarding Indigenous rights, regarding Black Americans and so forth. All of these things are getting fed into it. And of course, it's distorted and it stereotypes and it crosses the line into anti-Semitism, certainly at times. But we have to understand that this isn't an expression of protest against, as people have said, against a broken world. They might be looking in the wrong direction. They might not be. But please let us not forget, and this is something John referred to, which is there is a war going on. And there's a war where no matter how much we love Israel, no matter how much we care about Israel, no matter how much we are horrified by the massacre of October 7th, that there are tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed, have been killed. God knows how many more will be killed in Gaza. And this is something that people care about. And why they care about those tens of thousands being killed in Gaza more than many thousands being killed in conflicts all over the world is another issue. Israel and Palestine have always been central to people's imagination. But the other main point I want to make about university campuses and why this particular struggle is so difficult compared with, say, 50 years ago and the Vietnam War or the anti-apartheid struggle of, 40 years ago, that there's never been a case, at least in living memory, on a university campus anywhere, where you did not have university students against the administration so much as university students against each other. That's the problem. There were very few Afrikaner students at Stanford University in 1978 when I was there, picketing against Stanford's ties with South Africa or whatever. We had Jewish student bodies at the major universities. They're present, their feelings matter, their views matter. And regardless of what people intend, sometimes they intend to be anti-Semitic, sometimes they don't. We live in an era where impact tends to have greater weight than intent. And a lot of what is being said on the campuses is interpreted by Jewish students as being anti-Semitic. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The point is we've never been here before. Right? We've never had a case where we have these students who are so at odds with each other. And it's not just Jews versus non-Jews, because at least at Harvard, and I think elsewhere, there's a fair number of Jewish students who are quite ardently pro-Palestine. But this is an internecine struggle. That's what makes the campus situation now so much more difficult than it was 40 years ago or 50 years ago. John.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, unfortunately, that you have to add to it is it's not just about the war. It's about 50 years of occupation. Yeah. And behind, and we can all argue about missed opportunities and peace processes that fail, but we're dealing with an occupation. And, there are many on the, whether they're Jews or non-Jews, that include that. Along with the war, and you shouldn't forget about it. On the question of DEI, I agree with Dylan 100% that there are flaws in it, but DEI is all about the pendulum finally swinging back to the Blacks and the Latinos and the others who frankly and women who frankly for years were the minorities and dealt with as minorities. And, we all may be tired of, you have to be very careful, but tired of the kind of programming we're seeing or the faces we're seeing, we're thinking, oh, it's gone too far. But that's a pendulum. And the pendulum, it has to swing that way because these people have been minorities and treated like minorities for a long time. What offends me is what's going on in Florida and in Texas. I mean, the anti-wokeism is all about racism. It is all about the concerns of white Americans and some in the Conservative Party of Canada who don't want to be threatened by immigrants. They don't want to be threatened by Blacks in the United States. They don't want to be threatened by people coming in and taking their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And the anti-wokeism strays far more into racism than does DEI, present a concern because it hasn't dealt with anti-Semitism. Sure, it should deal with anti-Semitism, although there should be anti-Semitism policies that are separate from DEI, frankly, and I hope there are, and there are, just like there are anti-Islamophobia policies. But the stuff that's going on, I hope that the stuff that's going on in the southern states, basically taking courses out, taking books out of libraries, the whole thing. You can also move into a heavy dose of racism, and we should be careful about that at the same time.
So, John, just on that point, I mean, and it's not exactly what's going on in Florida, but it's partially here. I mean, the government of Alberta is working through Bill 20, which was a reaction to something slightly different, but will make every grant that goes to a researcher in a university subject to ministerial approval at the provincial level. And one of the things they're talking about is, problematic subject matter. So that culture war piece is here. And I've heard conservative MPs say, look, we're coming for this stuff. We're going to rip it out brick by brick. We're going to go into SSHRC, which is the body that funds the social sciences and humanities here, and we're really going to go after it. I mean, that's very worrying for academic freedom and the entire academic enterprise. And I guess I would also say that in this case also, where you're talking about the use of anti-Semitism as the justification, again, I think anti-Semitism and Jews are being made, the canary in the coal mine, but sort of the example in a way that's not, these guys are using this as the example to get at something else that they're trying to get at. It's a tool. And I think that's dangerous for the Jewish community whenever it's done in all circumstances.
Agreed.
So we're at our time limit with just a few minutes left. I want to invite, before I turn to Rabbi Kay, I'd like to go back to Mackenzie. Of all the panelists, she's the one who's closest to her recent years as not only a university student, but an activist. And while some of us were active when we were students, that was a long time ago. And I'd like just to invite you, if you had any particular thoughts, having listened to the panel. And in particular, I'm curious about how you, now working for an organization that represents or is involved in community representation, having before been a university-based activist, how you see the relationship between the role of external bodies in expressing their views, some would say interfering with the roles of the university. Certainly when I was involved in university affairs, one had a sense that our institutions, our norms, our principles, our values were sufficiently resilient and strong and clear that we were able to handle these issues in a responsible way, do it publicly, have dissent, have debate, without the community of those in the university, students, faculty, or staff, being threatened. If the perception now is that that's been weakened, has changed, I'm wondering the extent to which external organizations are contributing to that. That you're forcing university administrations, university faculty, not only to look inwards, but to look outwards in terms of the politics of managing things like academic freedom, dissent, the integrity of one's research agenda, what you teach in classes.
For sure. I think that's a really good conversation. And I also think that I want to highlight that I work in the Jewish community. I advocate on this every single day, and I haven't lost a single friend on the conflict. I've had some really hard conversations with even my own family that have been really anti-Semitic things to say. But I wouldn't be here working in the Jewish community had I not had Jewish community leaders tap me on the shoulder and say, listen, you're a student activist, you have a degree in international relations, would you consider going on CJ's Israel Young Leaders program? I went on the program and I asked hard questions on both sides, and I was able to engage in it in good faith. And I will also say personally, one of my best friends is an organizer at some of these Palestinian protests, and we talk and we have good conversations, and we might disagree, but a lot of times, like, I don't think she's an anti-Semite. She grew up in Hong Kong, where conversations of democracy and land and freedom fundamentally align with the pro-Palestinian cause. And how am I, as a Christian, as a Canadian, supposed to look her in the eye and tell her that that's not how she's allowed to feel? But at the same time, we do have a lot of things in common. I have said many times on this panel that, like, I think the encampments are justified, and if they didn't have hate in them, I think personally, a lot of times pro-peace activists are a little bit naive, but they're not anti-Semitic, and there's a lot of value in that optimism a lot of times. But all of that to say that I think your conversation about external bodies is also really, really important, and that beyond, like, you can take external bodies as a lot of different things. Is it civil society organizations? Is it non-students in these protests? Or is it even nefarious state actors? Because what I have found so interesting about this conflict specifically is that I work in this field every single day. I have conversations with Global Affairs Canada about current events in the Gaza Strip and the Gaza envelope. And I have seen full hour-long podcasts from journalists that I formerly respected about things that Global Affairs Canada have told me are untrue. And so I have friends come to me in earnest, being like, listen, this is a really big issue. I know that what I'm seeing online is biased. Like, where do I start? And I sometimes spend hours a day looking into some of these different things. And even on Instagram and on TikTok, you can watch a video that anyone can create, by the way, and the algorithm will show you different comments depending on what they think. And they'll filter even the reactions to videos based on what your preferences are. And even some of the disinformation I get. The other day, I got an advertisement for backpacking Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. I wish I was joking. But all of these things and this information warfare, quite frankly, that a lot of people don't even realize that they are subject to. And so I don't know if it's quite university campuses that are the place where we like can't have these conversations anymore. But it's around the dinner table with many different things, because I just think that we have access to so much information, and there's nefarious actors that, you know, make it a certain way and you can't consume it all, where people get hardened in these views and in these echo chambers with these perspectives, that they can't see how you wouldn't see things the way you do. Because if you saw all of their information, you might think that way too. And so I think that what I am thankful for is that I was in a university environment where I was exposed to different views. I have friends in the Conservative Party, in the Liberal Party, and the New Democratic Party. And that is fundamentally important, to have things in common and social structures in place with people that don't think the same as you about the free market, about political things, so that you can have critical conversations with people other than the people who already agree with you.
Thank you, everyone who's participated. Let me thank all those in the audience as well. One day we're going to be able to have a format that more of all of you, that's a way of putting it, can participate. But it's good to see so many interested. And let me turn this back to Rabbi Kay for the last few words, and say that we all look forward to being back together early in the fall.
Yes, thank you, David. So just the lightest reflection on this, of course, is that Mackenzie was ending by telling us the importance of hearing a variety of opinions and having diligent conversation based in fact, and sitting with people you don't agree with. And, you know, this morning is a wonderful example of all of those things. Our panelists did not agree with each other on every piece of this, and I'm sure many of you did not agree with some of the things that they said, and so on and so forth, and yet we had a diligent and important conversation. And if only we could do that more often, if only we could do that in more places. I will remind everyone once again that Brothers and Sisters in Arms, which is one of these groups that was fundamentally like vital in the work last summer to defend Israeli democracy, is sending a representation to Toronto starting this weekend. If you would like to be put in touch with one of their leadership, please email me before Shabbat, SCKAYE@holyblossom.org. Happy to connect you with them and let them know what you can do and how you can be involved. I will also just say Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, Shavuot is this week, and may your study of Torah and its impact in your life only be increased in our coming year. Thank you very much, and we will see you in the fall when we return with another semester of Israel Dialogues. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Wow.